Renaissance art, what do you picture? Chances are it's a lot of white people in nice clothes. Also Jesus. White Jesus. If the image of a black person ever comes to mind, it's probably of a wise man or a servant. So here's the thing. Though there wasn't an overly abundant population of blacks in Europe, the conspicuousness of black people made their presence not at all insignificant. We will be looking at 6 different pieces of art, exploring how black people were used in Western art during the Renaissance, and how it fits into the larger story of art history. The first stop on our itinerary is the Museo de San Marco, home to Fra Angelico's The Healing of Justinian by St. Cosmas and St. Damien. Depicted are the twin saints, Cosmas and Damien, floating above the sleeping form of an ailing Emperor Justinian I, as they perform a limb transplant using a leg from a fresh cadaver. Saints Cosmas and Damien carried instruments to amputate the leg and replace it with the leg of a recently deceased Moor. The Moor's burial was opened and his leg was severed and connected to Justinian's stump. 2 saints dug up the freshly buried body of a black person to then cut it, mutilate it, and graft it onto a white person's body. Especially with blacks frequently playing the part of a servant in Western art, it's hard not to associate their presence with a feeling of objectification. This painting, while complex in its meaning, takes that feeling of objectification to a new extreme. Exiting the museum, we travel southward to the Uffizi Gallery. Perseus Frees Andromeda is a painting done by Piero de Cosimo. It portrays the scene from Ovid's Metamorphosis, where Perseus saves Princess Andromeda from a sea monster and eventually wins her hand in marriage. Many questions may arise from the choices an artist makes in a given composition, what the artist chooses to present in a work, but also what isn't shown. For example, because Andromeda is consistently identified as being the daughter of an Ethiopian king and queen, she's often depicted as a black woman, but in this painting, she's rendered with fair skin. Despite Andromeda being depicted as white, one of the musicians celebrating the marriage between Andromeda and Perseus is depicted as black. The figure in question is playing an unknown, unplayable instrument containing the characteristics of 2 contrasting classes of instrument, woodwind and stringed. This choice comes directly from the ancient Greek mythology of the battle between Apollo and Marsyas. More specifically, it tells of a musical competition between the woodwind flute of Marsyas and the stringed lyre of Apollo. It is also worth noting that the depiction of black figures as musicians in Renaissance artwork is an incredibly rare sight, further cementing a theme of disruption. Within the Gospel of St. Matthew is where we find the biblical story of the Magi, the story of how 3 learned men from the East, bearing opulent gifts, came to worship in the presence of the newborn baby Jesus. A verse from the Pseudo-Bede is where the adoration gets its idea of the dark or black king. The adoration of the Magi was commissioned by Friedrich the Wise for the Wittenberg Schlosskirche altar. Dürer used key details from the story of the 3 kings from the East in this painting. People from this region were more likely to be of a darker complexion due to the harshness of the sun. He places a person of color in this painting to make it as accurate as possible. As this painting became more known, it was important because it, quote, allowed artists to depict the king's wondrous gifts in exotic splendor. This allows us to understand how people of color were viewed in this painting. People of color were viewed as exotic due to the fact that they did not look like most Europeans. This allowed Dürer's work to stand out. Dürer had a particular description for Africans, stating, quote, that they are rarely lovely due to their very flat nose and thick mouths. Outside of the worship scene, you can see this in his other works. He seems to have been influenced by a number of important concepts, such as the idea that artists must be aware of how people differ from one another. Continuing with our theme of the Magi, we're going to take a 10-minute walk to Palazzo Medici Riccardi to look at the Magi Chapel. The journey of the Magi, when looked at in full, is a complete work spread across 3 to 4 different paintings. 3 of those paintings depict each Magi and their entourage on the way to see Christ, while the 4th focuses on the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. The painting we chose to focus on depicts the journey of King Caspar, the youngest Magi, and his entourage. Behind him is Cosimo de' Medici and his attendant, who is a person of color, specifically the only person of color in this particular piece. This begs the question, why does it matter? What is or was the significance of this attendant as the only prominent black figure in the work? The answer is found by looking at how he is being depicted as a whole. At first look, you can see how Guzzoli painted him with the same amount of detailing as the rest of the Magi's procession, who are being represented by the Medici clan. The only thing different about him, aside from his skin, are his clothes, a simple shirt with different colored leggings. Now, this doesn't seem too important until you look at the rest of the entourage in the piece. Only a select few have different colored leggings. To be precise, there are only two people, the attendant and Piero de' Medici, son of Cosimo, on the other side of the Medici clan. Both have one red pant leg, which we can infer refers to their ties with the Medici clan, as red is one of their signature colors. Their other pant legs, however, are different colors. The attendant's is white, while his counterpart's is black. Knowing this, we can infer that both men have a similar or the same status. The different colored legs represent who they serve, specifically who they belong to. With this in mind, we can now somewhat understand the significance of the attendant as the only prominent black figure. It's to show that even though he is depicted as a servant or apprentice, he is still shown as being on the same level or given the same opportunities as his peers despite being different. We can't take this as fact. We can only make inferences. Rest depends on perspective. It is at this point that we will exit the palazzo and return to the Uffizi for our final itinerary stop. It is here that we see, instead of a black African acting as the attendant to a Medici, we see someone of black African descent who is a Medici themselves. Alessandro de' Medici, natural son of Lorenzo de' Medici, was born to a woman of African descent within a household where his African heritage was rarely mentioned. He was nicknamed Il Moro, meaning the Moor, which in our social context is a period drama set during Italy's Renaissance and based on the life of Alessandro de' Medici, the first black head of state in modern Western Europe. His portrait was commissioned to Giorgio Vasari by Ottaviano de' Medici. Ottaviano was the guardian of the young Alessandro de' Medici and a member of the Florentine government. On the accession of Cosimo I de' Medici in 1537, as Duke of Florence, he became one of the Duke's most trusted counselors. Alessandro is portrayed as a full figure wearing armor, which reflects the Michelangelo statue of Giuliano de' Medici, who was the ruler of Florence. This puts Alessandro at the same level as a white ruler, which, in a sense, broke the racial chain and put them at the same social standard, which is rarely seen in early European societies. In the background, there's a peak of the city of Florence that's brighter than the foreground itself, that seems to indicate the bright future Alessandro is leading towards.